Good evening, everyone. My name is Martin Payton and I'm the Manager of Arts and Culture for the City of Greater Geelong, and on behalf of the Word for Word National Non-Fiction Festival and the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to this special festival preview event. The Geelong Regional Library Corporation acknowledges Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar original owners of the lands of which our library services operate and our festival runs. We pay respect to Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar elders past, present and emerging. And we acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. The Word for Word National Non-Fiction Festival is a unique annual literary event showcasing non-fiction writing in all its many facets and forms. And this is the 7th year of the festival. I'm a member of the Festival Advisory Committee and I'm excited to be involved in Word for Word, which this year will take place entirely online for over 3 days, from Friday the 20th of November to Sunday the 22nd. The theme is life-changing, and isn't that a theme for our times? The program boasts 20 sessions over 3 days, including a fantastic schools program and partnerships with leading First Nations publisher Magabala Books. The stellar lineup of presenters includes former Governor-General Sir Peter Cosgrove, Virginia Trioli, Richard Desai, Louise Milligan, Claire G. Coleman, Heather Morris, and for the first time we have international guests joining us live. The Word for Word Festival has never shied away from hard-hitting non-fiction topics, and this year is no exception, with sessions exploring religion, politics, feminism, ethics and prejudice, chronic illness, ageing and much more. To explore the full festival program, head to Word for Word Festival website, which is wordforwordfestival.com.au. And I also encourage you to sign up for the festival e-newsletter, and we'll be sending out a link after this event. And now I have great pleasure in introducing our special guests for this evening, authors Christopher Raja and Olympia Paniatopoulos, with our facilitator, Harriet Gaffney. I will now hand over to you, Harriet, and what I'm sure will be a very fascinating discussion.
Thanks so much for that, Martin. Good evening, everyone. I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, which, like the Geelong Regional Library Centre, is the peoples of the Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar nations. First Nations people, the people whose lives were changed most irrevocably by colonisation, and so I think it's really fitting that we pay attention to that as we launch this preview event. I would also like to pay my respects to the Aranda people of Mbantua, which is the country where Chris Raja and I met about 2 decades ago now, and to the traditional owners of the lands our 2 authors are broadcasting from today. I have the pleasure of having the housekeeping reminders for you as well. So for those of you who are new to this format, you can participate in this live webinar by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing your question or your comment. If you're using an iPad or an iPhone, you may need to touch your screen to see the Q&A and chat functions. And then once you've seen them, you can type in your message or your question for the authors. I'll let you know that this webinar is being recorded. If you'd like to watch this discussion again or recommend it to friends or family, it will be uploaded to the library's YouTube channel within the next couple of days. Before we begin, a little bit of background about myself. I'm a writer, creative producer and arts professional with more than 25 years experience in the literary, visual arts and festival sectors. I've had the great pleasure of being a Word for Word facilitator for the last 5 years, and I currently work as the Arts Development Officer for the Surf Coast Shire. It is now my very great pleasure, however, to introduce tonight's guests, Olympia Paniatopoulos and Christopher Raja. Will you please show yourselves now? Hello.
Hi, Harriet. Hello.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Olympia Paniatopoulos was born in Melbourne to Greek parents. She comes from a long line of storytellers who inspired in her a love of folklore, myths and legends. Themes of identity and belonging are central to Olympia's writing, and she's a strong advocate for celebrating bold female characters in story and in everyday life. Christopher Raja is an Indian-born Australian author of short stories, essays, a play, novel, and now a memoir. His debut novel, The Burning Elephant, was published in 2015, and it was written with the assistance of an Australia Council New Work grant. Christopher has twice been shortlisted for the NT Writers Centre's Chief Minister's Book of the Year Award, and he migrated from Calcutta to Melbourne in 1986 and spends his time now between Melbourne and Alice Springs. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
Chris, I may begin with you if that's okay, primarily because in some ways I feel that your story, it's one that we probably understand a little better, though for me, Olympia sort of speaks to me quite strongly too, but the Australian public, you know, we understand it to an extent. So your family, because you migrated with your family when you're a young boy, so you were born outside of Australia. How old were you when you arrived?
So I was 11 years old when I arrived in Melbourne in 1986. It was in January. So we'd gone from winter, Calcutta winter, which is hotish, to summer in Melbourne. And it was also around the same time as my mother's birthday. So we joked a bit and said, haha, this is your birthday present, Mum. You know, a new country, a new land, and a new beginning.
This wide baked land after sort of the wet season. What led though for your parents to pick up and move like that, to make such a life-changing move?
So my parents were teachers and principal in Calcutta. They had you know, their own stories and own backgrounds. So Dad was an orphan, but he was a bit of a self-made man and became a principal by the age of 30. Wow. And Mum was born in Kerala. So Dad was born in Mumbai and Mum was born in Kerala. And Mum was a school teacher. And they both met in the state of Bengal and were doing quite well. And I was an only child. And just before we came to Australia, there was this sense of, well, there was one of the major incidents that happened was the assassination of Indira Gandhi. Mm. And that was the first time I had seen sectarian violence in India. And so I think it frightened my parents. It was quite a frightening time, but Dad was well ahead of all this. And so we knew that there were certain issues that, you know, and opportunities that could be had overseas. And so there were a lot of people leaving India and going either to the States or Australia. And so we were part of that, you could call it brain drain. And we moved to Australia, and my parents were keen for the opportunities that would come with that move.
It's interesting you mentioned this word brain change, and sort of that's the facilitator's worst nightmare when you know one of your authors asks you a question which you've or basically brings up a question that you've got way down the sheet, you know, way down your sheet. But I'm going to return to you as this 11-year-old boy, because one of the things I think is really striking about the memoir is it is completely through the eyes, you know, the lens of an 11-year-old. So you in many ways, you're not carrying that baggage, it seems. That, I mean, I love that you've had this really long flight and you get to Singapore and, you know, you get off the plane and you're desperate for the first sign of, you know, what this new you would be. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So, you know, India was still coming out of a socialist kind of economy at the time in the, you know, I'm talking in the 80s. So this is pre-Rupert Murdoch taking over the airwaves and things like that. And so we were only entitled to take $20 out, 20 Australian dollars, so, you know, each. So we had about 60 Australian dollars as a family, Mum, Dad, and I. And me being the only child looked at this gleaming pair of Reebok runners at the airport store. And I just had to have them. And I didn't know that this was going to play such an interesting metaphor. So I wanted these new shoes desperately. And my parents, for better or worse, spoilt me and bought me the pair of shoes, which I then wore with great pride. And, you know, it was not as daggy as the black school shoes that I was wearing, you know, the Calcutta formal that I was still holding. And now I all of a sudden looked a bit foreign. So I thought it was very cool. And should I keep going with that story?
I do like that story. I think it really speaks to you, and you had this consciousness from, you know, the moment you hopped on the plane, the new me, you know, life has changed, and how do I set myself up for this new world?
Well, my parents would talk about this, you know, where's the top? You know, where are we going? To the top. And where's the top? And the top was down under. So all these word games were going on in my head, and I'm thinking, okay, we're going somewhere. We're going to the top. It's the place to go. But geographically, it was at the bottom. So my 11-year-old brain was trying to comprehend all of this. And, you know, it was a big plane. It was going overseas. There was dollars instead of rupees. You know, people were white in this other continent. So I was still wondering whether I would turn white. You know, I had all these questions. And I also, because we weren't fed, as I said earlier, the visions of Rupert Murdoch and the Hollywood kind of images that we have now, or the internet images, my perception of what Australia was like was drip fed through 1970s and 80s films. So they were American films. So I thought it was going to be a mixture of, you know, an American film with the highways and stuff like that. And I had no idea what Australia would actually look like. You know, I could not imagine what, except I thought maybe a blonde person with a surfboard, or someone like Bob Hawke with a surfboard. That's about it.
I've heard a fabulous quote, or this, you know, line that you had in regards to Bob Hawke, and that you expected all Australians to be as friendly as Bob Hawke, you know?
Well, Dad was an avid listener to Radio Australia. And so he, you know, he knew a bit about the political scene, and he would talk about it. In fact, he was, you know, very interested in the union movement. And so Bob Hawke was quite popular amongst, you know, Indian intellectuals because, you know, he was a trade unionist. And so Calcutta, you know, being a Marxist state, you know, Dad was interested in what people like Bob Hawke had to say. And so when Bob Hawke came to Australia, he specifically went to Kerala, which was the other Marxist communist state in India at the time. And so, and he did come with a surfboard. So we did talk about it as a family, and we did try and make sense of this Australian Prime Minister who was a trade unionist, but also a ex-beer guzzling, surfy.
Yeah.
It was quite confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us about school for you, you know, so we might step back a little bit. So you've arrived, you stay with family for the first however long, and then you move into a flat.
Yeah. So yes, there was a lot going on. So I'm staying with my cousins, and, you know, these were the days where you can, where it was family reunions. And so we're a very close family, but I'm a bit cheeky, right? And so I highlight the differences, and, you know, and people have said, how could you be so rude to talk about your loved ones like that? And I wasn't being rude. I was just trying to highlight my incredulity of what Australians look like and how they dressed and their behavior. And so, you know, I was literally shocked that women, you know, dressed as flamboyantly, whether they were my cousins or friends or women at the pool. I was just shocked by that because I hadn't really seen it. So my brain was like, are they breasts and are they these things? And am I really seeing that? Because it was a different kind of childhood. It was a very, as I said, a very sheltered childhood in India. We did not have the exposure of all the things that we have now with the internet and things like that. And so when I saw my cousins, even though they looked like me, they were completely foreign, and their interests were like in Madonna and Prince, and so they were really exotic to me. And so I took a while adjusting, and then we moved out of the family, you know, the cousin's household, into another place, which was around Springvale, and it's a very multicultural area. And there was another shock to me that this was Australia, but not everyone was white, there were lots of Vietnamese and South American and people talking in languages other than English. And this was on one hand, and Greek, and there was this multicultural and ethnic pot. And whilst it was very comforting, it was also quite challenging, because in a way it was like we were all trying to make our mark, and so we were all different, and we were all pushing each other around, a bit like the literary scene in Australia, because there's so few prizes, and so everyone's sort of competitive, and and that was in a sense the nature or the milieu of the suburb that Springvale was, because there were people who were really had really come from very difficult backgrounds, much more difficult than I had, who were trying to make their mark, and so we were all mixed up together. And there were people running from Pinochet, there were people, refugees from Vietnam, and so it was a very charged environment.
And yet at the same time, it's really interesting to me, because I think one of the things that the book really looks at, and that's when I talk about the public perception of Indian migrants in this country, is that we don't recognise that there is actually a very large group of migrants that were the educated middle classes, the intellectual elite moved, came from India. And I think Rowena Gonzalez also addresses that really well in her book, The Permanent Resident. But so your parents were working, they had this extraordinary work ethic, didn't they? So you were at home a fair bit on your own when you were in Springvale?
I describe my mum as an early feminist. I mean, she had a baby and she went back to work, and they were all my aunts and all my mum and her sisters, come from the state of Kerala, where they were all educated and all went to university and, university educated. So this idea of carrying trauma from your old country, that we're all just like, this idea of like being saved by coming to Australia. We weren't being saved. I mean, at the moment, it's great to be in Australia with the COVID thing, but at the time, I mean, it was an opportunity for sure. But, mum and dad had pretty good lives and jobs and status, but dad and mom were very sensitive, and they could see that all of it wasn't that clear. They were always trying to help people that were struggling.
And that's what I found in those scenes set in Springvale. I mean, they were working really hard. You've come home from school, the house, so you spent a lot of time in the greengrocer downstairs. And I really like one of the things I did find the point of view really interesting in this book, and the way that we're led to recognise certain things. But that was in those scenes in the greengrocer. I was reminded in some ways of Arnold Zabel's Cafe Scheherazade, because there, where you had different cultural groups coming together, there was the shared affinity around the sort of the hard work and the caring for one another and stuff as well, that I thought, heart to me of those stories that we do know about, people who are forced into, close proximity and have come from, whose lives have been completely turned upside down.
Well, it's interesting that you should bring up Cafe Scheherazade. So, so I did want to use that fruit shop, in a sense, as a metaphor. And so, so it was a metaphor in some ways, because I'm very much interested in different genres. So I'm interested in novel and poetry. And so I thought the idea of a fruit shop could tell a lot very quickly. And as you can see, I don't like to use too many words in the writing. I try and streamline the book as much as I can. And that was coming from, because my first book was a play. So I come from, and I don't like to use too many words. And so some of my writing can have a staccato effect, but that's I'm trying to do that. And so I'm often looking for the metaphor or the image. And so I thought the idea of the fruit shop, and then mixing, the South American woman who paints with the left hand, and then of course, I just thought all of that just worked. You could say so much more. In terms of the loneliness and being surrounded by older people, that's always been the case for me. Being an only child, I've always had to be surrounded by older people. But that's another metaphor. Even in Australia, it was an aging population. And before I even realized it was an aging population, I sensed it, compared to India, which is still a growing, it's a younger population. So there was, and also it's another metaphor of the land being old. This is an old country. We thought we were coming to a new country. At least I thought I was coming to a new country. But everywhere I looked, there were old people, older people, grown-up people. And there was this hidden kind of, it was a bit like going up to the top, but coming down, going to the new country. And yeah, it's only celebrating its bicentenary, but it's this ancient country as well.
Yeah, there's this extraordinary,
It's a white country, but it's really a black country. There was just all these polar opposites. And so I tried to come to sense with this cultural amnesia by using certain metaphors and rather than going into the whole history.
And that's really interesting, and I'll bring you in soon, Olympia, because that was something too that struck me about it, is that, you know, so often books about migrants, some for better, some for worse, but they're enriched by, you know, the feature of the stories is often the smells and the flavors that speak so loudly of home, and they were almost entirely missing from this book, which I found really interesting. You know, that, you know, so it wasn't, you know, your mum didn't like cooking, you know, so it wasn't, you know, there wasn't at home this sort of focus on what you'd left. And for you as a young boy, it was always looking forward and always looking to, how do I make my place here?
Absolutely.
Which is, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, that was a very thought through in the sense that, in the same way that my previous book, The Burning Elephant, was always thinking about Australia, but never goes to Australia. You know, you don't see any of Australia until they. So I sort of play with stereotypes and tropes, like, for instance, the elephant, you know, like, you know, there'll be an elephant in my Indian book, but it's going to be killed, it's going to be shot, it's going to be killed, and it's going to be burnt. So I play around with that exoticizing, but to the point of like almost taking it to the complete extreme. And so, in the sense of coming to Melbourne, I didn't want to romanticize or exoticize what I'd left behind, because you know, it wasn't necessarily exotic. I mean, you know, they were working class mother and father. I mean, you know, working mother and father. They had proper jobs, normal jobs, like they had here, and there is a certain amount of blandness that comes when you do live in the suburbs, and it's bland. And yes, you've got your orange lino kind of kitchenette, and you know, you've got your gas and your ducted heating, and these are the great things. In a way, they're the exotic things when you do come from India, where you think, wow, hot air can come out of these ducts in winter. What a luxury. In fact, thankfully they do. If not, we will be freezing in Melbourne winter. So
I thought that was really masterfully done, you know, that real focus outward. You know, you've got, through this child's eyes, we're looking at how do they do it? What will I do, you know, to place myself in that world? And I thought that the way that you handled it during the writing of the text was really, you know, very, very clever. Olympia, I'm going to bring you in now, because in many ways, you know, your book is sort of, you know, it's a story that we know, it's a way of writing about heritage and, you know, migration stories that we know a little bit, you know, over the last 20 years or so. And, you know, I'll let you know, there are recipes up the end of the book, and they're delightful. They're not woven through it, which I like, because I'm, you know, I like to read and then I like to do the food thing. But Olympia, your story is different because you were actually born in Australia, weren't you?
Yes, yeah.
And so tell us a little bit about your family. So you're born here in Melbourne, but you still had concerns, you know, so you're born in Melbourne, but you still from an early age had concerns yourself about fitting in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I was the only child that was born in Australia. So there were seven in my family. And so I'd heard a lot about Greece, and of course my family were Greeks, and living in Melbourne, trying to create their life here and struggle those early years. And there was a big contrast for me. I had a lot of Aussie friends at school, and like a lot of people like me, you know, I liked what they had too, and I felt very different at school and very different at home.
Tell me about your lunches.
Oh, my lunches.
Your school lunches.
Well, I really envied their sandwiches. Were always wrapped up in wax paper, and their teddy bear biscuits. So I always wanted the teddy bear biscuits, and I used to have like awkward pieces, thick pieces of bread with like a sausage in it and that. And yeah, I always wanted kind of to be a bit more like them. But also too, I was also different at home. So I often refer it to dancing between two worlds, because I thought that originally I kind of thought that I was just trying to fit in with my Aussie friends, but I also felt left out at home. So it was, you know, a lot of complex emotions, trying to understand things, you know, that really I couldn't have understood at such an early age of what was going on.
I think it's a really, I mean, I think it's, you touch on something there that's really, I think it's probably prevalent for a lot of us whose parents, you know, like I'm second generation Spanish Australian. And, you know, that thing about, like, you and I, we spoke on the phone last week, and you talk in the book about longing and longing to fit in and longing to belong, and about how you'd always dreamt of Greece.
Yes, definitely, all the time. And see, I did have friends at school that were Greek, and a lot of them had been back, and I hadn't been, and all I really wanted to do was to go there, because I had known things through all of them, and I was the only one that hadn't experienced them. I had no idea of grandparents, uncles, aunts, and in Australia, my parents, when they arrived in 55, there was nobody here waiting for them. So it was the friends that they'd made on the ship, wherever they lived, wherever they found work, but there was no like blood relatives. And so I think from a really early age, Harriet, there must have been something, even though I wouldn't have kind of been aware of it at the time, that kind of said to me, well, I need to know about them and perhaps then know more of myself, which I didn't really do until I started to really research for the book and the stories. That I was very aware of it then, but I must have been, when I was younger, that longing, and it was a real longing. It was, you know, if I could have jumped on a plane at 10 years of age, and that went right up until when I eventually did go in 1981. And I still have that, and I think at some point I had to kind of make peace with the fact that I was never born there. I could never experience that, and that was the real hunger for knowing, for my mum's stories. It never let up. I'd drive her crazy. It was always, and tell me every detail, what did you wear and what did you do? It was never ending. And but then I just had to kind of, you know what I knew and be happy with that. And
So I'll talk a little bit, I'll just explain for the audience who haven't read the book. So the story you tell in Beneath the Fig Tree is primarily your mother's. So she was a woman who spent her entire life in a tiny village, and as you said to me on the phone last week, she hadn't even been to Athens. And so as part of the everyday life, you know, people were growing food for the family, she was making lace and sewing, she was doing what young girls do as they grow up, flirting and becoming a young woman. And then she marries your father and they have 6 kids. And they choose
4 kids.
4. 3 more were born here.
No. There was we were 7 total. But 4 of them were born in Greece.
Okay, 5 kids, 2 adults. Okay, excuse me. And so then they leave, you know, to go to the other side of the world with nothing, knowing no one, as you've already mentioned. And it seems like the book, one of the beauties of the book is it is like being in Greece. You know, you really so beautifully get that small, the small beauties of the everyday. Alain de Botton said that the difficulty of life has thrown into relief the beauty of modest things. And when I read that sometime in the last week, it really struck me, you know, that you know, for your family and for many migrant families, that, you know, absolute ardor with which they tend their gardens, with they make relationships with the birds that want to steal the almonds from the tree, you know, and the constant sort of, you know, tending to plants and pots and growing more and more and more, you know.
Well, that was their life.
Yeah.
That was their life in Greece. And I guess also too that I thank God that that was their life there, because they brought that here and they recreated. And in a sense that was like, that gave them, it was comforting, because there was a piece of the homeland with them at all times, and the way they did things. And
it's that too, you know, like Chris, I was, you know, when I mentioned that, you know, there's not much of that domestic interior inside your book, and that's not that common for migrant stories, but it's like both of your stories, you know, your family have brought what they know and what they knew best and what they did best, you know, to this country, and worked from there forward. So what was I going to go on? So I wanted to know then, for you, Olympia, when you journeyed back to Greece with your parents, did it reconcile your longing?
It kind of did. I didn't obviously find my grandfather there, and I did meet relatives and that, but definitely, yeah, it's strange, you know, when I was writing the book, it's a bit hard to describe. I actually got so into the stories that I almost felt, and I realized what I'd been trying to do. I'd been trying to be the child in Greece through my mother. So it was a really, almost a bit of a bizarre feeling being there, because I almost felt that I had been, because the longing was so intense that when Mum was telling me the stories when I was writing, I was imagining that it was me. That it will always be the greatest time of my life, because I also find it a bit hard to believe that my parents are Greek. I'm born to Greek parents, and yet we only had 3 weeks together in that country in both of our lives. Only 3 weeks. And being there with them, seeing where she did this, where they lived, it was just beautiful. It was beautiful. I can't wait to go back and
further grow that relationship further. When we spoke last week, you said, and I loved this, it was a fabulous metaphor, that if you feel that you don't fit in, and excuse me, I've got 2 computers going, one with my notes. If you feel that you don't fit in, it is in every aspect of your life, like a stain. Everyone understands this, no?
What it kind of, when you're a child and you feel that you don't fit in, I think as you grow up and whatever you do in life, I think that unconsciously you've taken that not fitting in that situation, and you kind of, I'm not saying everyone does, and I'm not, you know, it might not be all throughout your life, but in certain things, there's a little bit of, I'm not the same, I'm different, I'm not equal, I'm not good enough, I'm a bit, these things don't happen maybe to people like me. And that's all those little, perhaps things that you might have told yourself when you were young, when you didn't really understand too much. And you see later on in life how those times have influenced you. And none of it's true. None of it's true. It's just that the impressions that were formed when you were little. And then you think, well, and to a point, I'll be honest and say maybe it was in certain things with me, like, you know, not really because I was Greek, but maybe a little bit. I grew up with a bit of that maybe I won't be able to achieve this or won't be able to do that because whatever, you know. Because...
I'm going to come to a question from the audience, and just before I do that, I will encourage everyone who's out there to use this Q&A function if you would like to ask a question, but I do have some questions already. So, sorry, I'm scrolling through them. So Mary asks, this is for both of you. I'd like to hear from both of you on this. Did you experience discrimination in your lives when you came to Australia? Chris, I'll start with you. Give Olympia a little break for a moment.
So my account is quite a chronological account, and in the book I do describe experiences where both, you know, in terms of, it depends what you mean by discrimination. I mean, you know, I just describe all out fights, you know, ending up in hospital, you know, having, going to parties but, you know, whether they were particularly racially or were they from discrimination, or was that part of growing, like, you know, this toxic masculinity of, you know, becoming a man in Australia is very different to, say, in countries like India. So, you know, it was part of this sort of growing up in the suburbs. So I'm reluctant to, I don't try and give things names. This is for Mary. I don't try and give things names. I try and present a few situations and let the reader decide what's going on. I mean, you know, each of the so I present scenes, say what happens to my father, for example, like a character. Even though it's my father, I present him like a character, and I show you what happens to him, and whether that's, you know, that's because of his own upbringing or you know, what he's carrying in himself, or whether that was discrimination. I don't have names for all of this. So, you know, they're there for other people to decide whether it's racism, classism, or mental health issues.
Mary, I'll come back to you in a second on that question. But Chris, I wanted to ask you, you had a fantastic line in the book regarding where you had a realisation about young men in Australia and what, you know, that there was a really concrete difference between a young man in India and a young man in Australia. Can you speak to that a little bit?
My work often looks at issues of masculinity, and so even when I'm describing, you know, scenes that are quite awkward, you know, whether it's involving girls or gangs or just youth, you know, there is a sense of just showing this sense of, you know, what would I call it? The stages of growth of men, where we're almost built to self-destruct. You know, it's not cool to be a nerd. You know, you don't show you know all the answers. You know, you don't start saying, hey, you guys are racist, I'm so great, as people seem to do on Twitter and stuff, because that's un-Australian. You know, you're supposed to be a bit more reticent, hold back, let other people come to their own conclusion. And so I'm a well-trained Aussie, you know. I know how to sit back and say nothing, you know. And so then occasionally I just write these books and throw them out there. And then sit back, because that's what being an Aussie male is. You sort of sit back and you don't say too much, because you let the work, you try and show a few scenes in the book, and then, you know, and then it's up to the reader to take it from there. Yeah. And so, you know, like when you're growing up, you learn very quickly not to react, you know, like whether it's on the footy field, or, you know, someone might call you a racial epithet that's, you know, that's going to sting you. And we often hear that from ex-footballers, you know, who've been called all these strange things. And then they go, but I was called that by you know, my teammates and the crowd, and yeah, that's how it was. And that, you were just called all, you know, all these names, and you had to just deal with it. And then occasionally, you know, you got someone back.
Olympia, what about you? Did you feel that, you know, being quite overtly a Greek Australian, you know, with, you know, the most beautiful Greek name, you know, did you feel that you experienced discrimination growing up in Australia?
Nothing really that too harsh, I don't think, but it's a really interesting question, because as I've been listening to Christopher talk and thinking about it, I wonder whether I experienced it more in my own mind than whether it was actually so much in my experience, because I'm wondering whether I saw myself so differently that I felt that others were seeing me like that. Yeah, there were times when I felt that, but then again, maybe it was just more in my mind that I felt, well, I didn't get to do some of the things that they did, and had I created more of a sense of feeling that, you know, I don't really think, I was never really picked on. I was never called WOG. I don't like that word. I don't really.
It's not overt.
No, yeah. But this isn't really, it's kind of related. I did get a chance to talk to somebody recently from my school days, you know, in grade, you know, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 we were back then. And I think I talked about this with you, Harriet, where we were like so different. He was a little Aussie boy and I was a little Greek girl, and rarely spoke or anything like that. And it was interesting how he read the book and he said to me, I never realised how hard it was for your parents. And when he was telling me this on the phone, I thought, I put us back into the classroom, you know, 6, 7 years of age. And I was thinking about this little Aussie boy, and he would have been seeing me as this little Greek girl. And I thought it was beautiful that he was able to, through the book, get a better understanding of the differences. And, you know, yeah.
That brings us really well to a couple more questions. Cecile asks, or she said that she's very interested in listening to these stories, and she's got a really, like, you know, a solutions-focused question, which I like. So how do we make a difference in supporting migrant families to make their home in Australia? You know, how do we accept people more, make it easier for people to make their home here? Would anyone like to jump in?
I'll have a go.
Yep.
I think that this is the beauty of sharing stories and getting an understanding of where people have come from. We are more alike than what we are different. We're all searching for the same sense of belonging, love, security. And I think that in sharing stories, I know that since I've been researching and since I'd written the book, I'm fascinated by listening to people, you know, tell me their story. And when you do listen to the stories, you become, I think there's allowing more compassion, more empathy, and I think that you realise that how alike we are, and that allows for, it kind of creates a space where they feel welcomed, and
I think that's such an important point about the more that we can share our stories, you know, whether they're hidden stories from history or whether they're stories of marginalised peoples, etc. The more we can share, the more we do definitely understand that we are at heart the
Yes.
same,
Yeah.
you know, species.
And we learn from each other. We learn from each other. The people who crossed the oceans and went to other lands, they brought such great gifts.
Yeah,
we're like a tapestry. Really, it's, you know, layers and layers, creating a richer society, and everyone has something of value to contribute.
Chris, what about you? I mean, you've lived not only in white, you know, the sort of literal coastline of Australia where it's primarily sort of, you know, fairly white Australian, and you've lived in Central Australia. What do you think about discrimination in Australia, and do you think that we can help people better? Well, there is another question from Beverly about, are we doing enough to help people assimilate?
Well, these are huge questions, and I'm not a politician, so I don't really have the answers about assimilation and all these things, which are huge questions. And I mean, I'm a writer, so what I try and do is write books and tell stories. And so I sort of concur with what Olympia said about the importance of storytelling, and I love that. I love stories, and that's why I write books and you know, and read books. And I think, you know, by reading, yes, I agree, we get we you know, we learn about empathy, and we learn how people take risks to come, and we learn about the history of the land and who it belongs to. And so, you know, it opens us up. And so I think the more we open ourselves up to books and storytelling, it broadens our perspective. And so I think that will automatically affect our behavior. But I don't have very clear answers. However, I was talking to a friend of mine in Vienna, and she's an author, and I told her that I was going to be doing this talk, and she said that she'd been reading a Czech intellectual who'd been writing about this topic, about migration and writing. And he talked about, he's been doing some research on migration, the act of migration, and he describes the act. His name is Willem Flausser, I think. And he talks about migration being a creative act. And that really struck a chord. And I thought to myself, yeah, because, and how, you know, migrants in a way have to play the same role as, say, writers do, because they have to put themselves out there. You know, they wear different clothes. They like bohemians. They come out with these funny clothes, with these funny food, with these funny haircuts, and funny languages, and funny mannerisms. And that's sort of like, and they're a bit shy because they're going against the dominant trend. And then they have to perform at work and really stand out. And that's in a way what a writer does. I mean, you know, we're sort of outsiders, and then we actually try and be insiders when we have to prepare for conferences and sell our books and stuff, and be on like a social stage, and you know, act like we know. And that's like migrants. I mean, you know, we're constantly juggling this creative kind of conflicting line where we're putting ourselves out there on one hand, but we're also wanting to hide and you know, keep things in reserve.
Yeah, and keep the difference hidden. I've got, Sula has said that in relation to discrimination and name, this is for you, Olympia, did you go by Libby, and when did you see yourself as Olympia? And she said that that's from someone who was called Jim instead of Dimitrios and only reclaimed his name in adult life.
I didn't really give myself the name Libby. In Greek, my name is Olympia. Olympia is Olympia. And so I was Olympia. And when I started working, people, well, actually, no. I, at school, got teased. My name was Olympia, the English version. And I used to get called Ollie from Olive Oil, Popeye's girlfriend. And I was only little. And
she was so skinny. And
Ollie, olive oil. So I chopped the O off and I became Libya. only to some people, and it wasn't, you know, of course I didn't want to get called Ollie. And then when I started working, I got called Libby. But it was never really anything, you know, oh, I hate my name, or I want to change it. It was none of that. I've always loved my name. It was and it just passed from one place to another. And I like it. There's a familiarity. I get called Lib. I get called Annie. It doesn't worry me. Yeah. I think as you grow older, you tend to kind of let go of some of the things that, you know, yeah.
Chris, this is an interesting one for you. This is from Elizabeth, and she says that she's sort of, this question came in before, but I was looking for the right time. So she asks that if you say that masculinity in Australia is different from Indian masculinity, what do you mean by that? And can you comment on misogyny in India? So, and of course.
Okay, good question. And to be honest, I can't, you know, I haven't grown up in India. I mean, I had my childhood in India, and you know, in terms of the rape and you know, the recent rapes of lower caste women and all this stuff that we read about. Now, I read about all that news about India as an Australian, you know, who has deep links with India. So I'm aware of that. But my awareness about masculinity and toxic masculinity is probably a bit more informed in Australia, because this is where I live, and this is also where I often, you know, am very hard on myself. So I look at my own behavior and I call myself out, you know, at numerous times in my memoir, you know, and people said to me, you know, Chris, did you know what you were writing? And I was like, absolutely. The bits that I was particularly hard on myself in the memoir were, I thought, the most important bits, because indirectly I was commenting on what makes a toxic man. And it starts very early on, and I display that within my own self. I use myself as a chemistry example and say, well, you put in that bit and you put in that bit and you get a toxic masculine man. At least I can write about it and reflect on it, and so and hopefully change and improve on it. So there was a lot of shame and self-reproach when I looked at my own behavior and continue to look at my own behavior. And I wanted to expose that. Not so much that I was wanting to beat myself up about it, but I wanted to add to the debate, because I read a lot of books about masculinity written by women in Australia. And I think, well, they're doing a great job to highlight these issues. But where's the men saying, where are we in all this debate? And, you know, when we hear about men killing their families, and when we hear about these crazy stories that Helen Garner might then write about, and she might present a man, but we don't hear from someone saying, hey, I was a young guy in the suburbs, because those guys were young guys in the suburbs growing up and then doing all those things. So I wanted to analyze my own behavior and what I knew. What I knew was what was inside me and some of my experiences. So, you know, it's fascinating being on this panel with Olympia. My first girlfriend was Greek, for instance, and I write about that in my book. And she was adamant not to, you know, introduce me to her parents. And partly because I was brown, partly because her parents were very strict. And so I would go and hang out with her and, you know, and sneak in and out of the house. And I just thought, gosh, what was going on there? You know, what was going on? I mean, what was I thinking? Okay, so I'm brown. I can't go into that house because I'm brown. She likes me, but she's Greek. And what, you know, like what would I do as a father if I found my own daughter in that situation, etc., because I'm much older now to reflect back on these issues. So I just wanted to show some of the contradictions in growing up and some of the mixed messages our youth get, whether they're boys or girls or adolescents in my case.
I'm going to make it so we're coming up towards the end of our session. I'm going to thank you both, you know, for being so willing to engage in these, you know, what can be more difficult questions. Jeanette, This is, I think, sort of more for perhaps the library and maybe myself too. So she says that my parents migrated to Australia from Holland in 1950 and she was 9 years old at the time. And she wonders if there are any stories of Dutch, or if there'll be stories of Dutch migration, Rochelle, as part of the festival. I will say to you, Jeanette, that last year as part of the festival, part of Word for Word, I interviewed Claire Bowditch about her memoir. So there's some really wonderful stories about her mother's family and what they brought from Holland to Australia. They grew up, you know, similarly to Olympia, as very much, you know, Dutch Australians. You know, Holland was very much sort of the bedrock of who her mother was and what she instilled in her children. Iris would like you to just go a little bit further into your emotional reactions to going back to Greece. And I'd ask that of you too, Chris, because you've been back to India. So might start with you, Olympia, and then we'll go to Chris. What was it like, you know, emotionally for you, Olympia? Because obviously it was your, you know, it was your first visit. Was it with your parents?
Yeah. It was very emotional. It was disbelief, because as I'd said, I dreamed of going back for such a long time, and finally I was there. And it was very emotional. I felt really attached. I didn't want to leave. I remember having to leave my parents. They still had a couple of months there, and I felt that I just wanted to stay. It was beautiful. It was confronting, because I had to, as I said earlier too, that I had to make peace with that. I'd never been there, but getting to experience the village and meet the people and see where my grandfather lived and where my mother played as a little girl was just extraordinary. It was beautiful.
Do you still find, you know, having returned, do you go back? Do you go back regularly now, or?
Well, I went back in 2006 and I haven't been back yet, because we were to be there this year. I was going to promote the book in Greece, and it was a really big thing. Been waiting for about 10 years. Yeah, that'll be next year.
Yeah, or the year after.
Yeah.
Chris, what about you? You know, when you first went back to India with your mum, how was that? How did you feel as a young man going back to India?
So it was in 1995. I'd made a point of not wanting to go back to India. So it was about 9 years after we came to Australia that I went back to India for the first time. And I was so busy in my Australian, developing this Australian identity, that the idea of going back to India was sort of seemed like a bit of a waste of time or a backward step. But in 1995, I was ready to go back for obvious reasons when you read the memoir. And Mum takes me. And so, but what struck me was the polyphonic place. So, you know, just the different languages, you know, going back to India, because Australia is a place of forgetting languages. India is a place of remembering languages. Everywhere you go, there's a different language, and people are very proud of their language. If you go to Bengal, or you go to Delhi, or you go to Madras, everyone's very proud of their state language. And so yet they can speak two or three. So, you know, so that was quite unique. That stood out. One of the other things that really stood out was this idea that, in the same way that I had this sort of foreign kind of sense of my family and relatives who'd lived in Melbourne, now I've gone back to Calcutta, and these relatives are foreign and alien and look different and act different and say things that are just like, you know, I could pick them apart in the same way that I could pick the relatives here. And I realized, I felt really like, I thought one day I'd go back there, I'd feel comfortable. One day I'd come here, I'd feel comfortable. And then I realized, oh, maybe I'm more comfortable back in Australia. And that's when, you know, I also started to think then of this notion of you know, who we are as people and whether we are actually these identities, or whether there was something more spiritual or something, you know, without going too airy-fairy.
Okay, I've just got the 1 minute with an exclamation mark on it. I want to thank you both so much for such a lovely discussion. Chris,
Thank you.
lovely to see you again. Olympia, lovely to see you, you know,
Thank you. Thank you.
in the virtual flesh. Can I just tell the audience that Beneath the Fig Tree is published by Affirm Press, and Into the Suburbs is published by the University of Queensland Press. Both books can be purchased online from the Word for Word Festival partner, James Bennett, at www.bennettbookstore.com, and that's Bennett with a double T. Or you can buy them from any of our excellent local bookstores who are all offering online ordering right now. Copies of the book are also available to borrow from the Geelong Regional Library Corporation. And I'm also going to let you know, please don't forget to join next week's library event, Matthew Riley with The Two Lost Mountains on Tuesday, the 27th of October. And of course, the Word for Word Festival in November. Again, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hope that we get to, you know, see you actually in the dome one day soon. But until then, on behalf of the library, everyone, thank you all for joining us tonight, and good night to you. Thanks very much.
Good night. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.